Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. My name is Ken Shorten. I'm here with London Paul. And Paul, even though Syria has taken over the headlines, things are continuing to go for Russia's favor in Ukraine. Uh, Paul, as always, want to thank you for being a part of this discussion. And we got some operational updates of what it looks like Russia is doing in Ukraine, and perhaps why Zelensky decided to shuffle himself over to Paris to try to ask for more money and help at the open rechristening of the Notre Dame Cathedral.
Yeah, well, thank you as well, obviously, for joining me today as well, Ken. Always a pleasure. Yeah, basically some operational stuff now. One thing that's interesting, and this has been in Western media sources, so is likely the figure's likely to be higher. But remember, there's always been this case of Russia's going to run out of missiles, drones. It can't keep producing them the way it is. And I mean, we heard this that they were going to run out 2 weeks after the war started. I mean, here we are, 2.5 years later. It's complete nonsense. But what I think is interesting is there's claims in the Western media that Russia's fired 4 to 5 times as many drones and missiles at Ukraine in the past 3 months, meaning September, October, November, than they did year on year. So we're talking thousands and thousands of these missiles and drones being fired. So not only does it disprove the idea that Russia's running out of missiles, but it also shows that they're heavily increasing the amount of missile strikes they're conducting in Ukraine. They're accelerating their offensive, which I think arguably could suggest that they're trying to end the war. There are rumors, and I stress rumors, that the war could be over in maybe 2 or 3 months. It's a possibility. Don't take us literally because it's a rumor, and it may not, of course, come to pass. The war could carry on for 2 or 3 more years. I don't think it will for 1 minute, but I'm just trying to illustrate a point. Another thing the Russians are doing, which the Ukrainians have acknowledged, is they're using these fake drones in these kind of so-called swarm attacks. They are similar from a radar signature of those Iranian Shahad, obviously suicide drones that have been used quite heavily by the Russians against Ukraine. And these decoy drones mimic that radar signature of the Shahad drones, which obviously causes abject confusion for what's, and I say, left of Ukraine's air defense systems. And of course, what this is, by all these drone strikes we've seen and this increase in drone strike, which is designed, of course, to damage Ukraine's air defenses, that this could also be indicative that Ukrainians believe, and maybe it's true or not, that this could then lead to a major attack on the nation's, what's left of its energy infrastructure, which frankly is not much, as we've discussed previously. And in general, there is a growing admission, even amongst the Ukrainians, that the entire front line is becoming an enormous problem for them. And I would say the front line's very fragmented. And Russia is repeatedly attacking all over the country, from the regions in the west all the way to regions in the east. So from places like Odessa, Sumy, Kiev, then you've got I think it's Vinnytsia and Ivano-Frankovsk, which are in the west. And obviously regions of east, all over the place. And this is repeatedly happening. And there's also claims that Ukraine could be losing 5 critical cities literally simultaneously in Donetsk. This includes that very key strategic hub, Pokrovsk. Also, I would say a key strategic hub is that Chazov Yar. And there's places called Mirnograd, Karakhovo, and also Toretsk. So if they go, there's an argument that could massively accelerate the end of the war. And what Russia's been doing in recent days is huge shelling of the key supply routes to Pokrovsk. and they're only a matter of a few kilometers, maybe 3-4 kilometers away from the city. They're also planning on landing on the right bank of the Dnieper River for an assault on Kherson. And you can see what's going on. There is this huge acceleration. And even though it's the winter months, and the belief is that Russia would start to slow down, because you get, when the ground becomes very soft and it's not conducive for fighting war, Russia continues despite that happening. And obviously, it's not going to be a lot of tank movement. That's going to be a problem. But certainly, they are moving heavily on foot as well. And, even the Ukrainians are beginning to admit this is a reality. And this is, becoming a crucial sort of turning point again, whereby Russia is just now relentless, and Ukraine lacks the military personnel, it lacks the resources and the equipment to support the people fighting on the front line, which is being rapidly disintegrating for a number of months.
Yeah, and interestingly enough, obviously, we're talking a 6-week, really about a 6-week period before Donald Trump is reinaugurated into office. And it's likely that the push is going to be absolutely for a ceasefire, if not an end to the conflict, including holding off any more weapons, money, etc., going to Zelensky. And you have to wonder, when Zelensky showed up in Paris, if that was impressed upon him that he needs to find some type of solution, because he did come out again and broach the concept of a ceasefire, and not with as much rigor as, we have these demands. It's more along the lines of he's seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. And it's the question of, if he gives in too much, he could be taken out by his own party, those involved in that who propped him up, or he could see the support coming from Europe and the United States / NATO come to a halt, which means that they're going to be running for their lives very quickly. So, with that being said, there's a six-week window. Russia probably knows this. Zelensky probably knows this. And I think that's why you're seeing the rush to get all the objectives necessary from Russia, getting rid of the Pokrovsk and all the defense lines, because that will be the primary thing of the demilitarization. And then from there, during the ceasefire, well, I heard rumor that there was, the potential for Zelensky to go to UK or wherever in exile. That will protect him from all the elements that have been pushing him to do this war. And the U.S., Trump will get his glory by bringing the war to an end, even though it wasn't him at all. So I think there's a lot of things at play between now and January 20th, when Trump comes into office.
Yeah, I discussed this in detail last time, Ken, about plans the US were considering, and Russia laughed them off and said, there's no chance that's happening, and there's not going to be a ceasefire. The war will either end from Russia's perspective, on their term, or the war carries on in perpetuity until the West agrees to what Russia's terms are. Russia's made that position very clear. Whether Trump understands this properly is debatable. Whether he accepts it is equally debatable. But he came out after, obviously, you said the meeting in Paris with Zelensky. He didn't want to meet Zelensky in Paris. That tells you everything. Macron convinced him the last moment, oh, please meet him. Trump came out and said that Ukraine wants to make a deal with Russia to end the conflict. I don't know whether Zelensky even said that to him. He probably didn't. They only spoke very briefly. I didn't get the impression Trump had much time for Zelensky in any way, shape, or form. I mean, he also called for an immediate ceasefire, Trump, and negotiations on Ukraine. There is never going to be a ceasefire. The war either stops in totality based on the conditions and an agreement that Russia wants what they want. Now, the West can contest that, and disagree profusely. But the war will have to end on the basis that whatever Russia wants to see in place is in place. And apart from that, there's no chance. So Trump needs to get out of his head the idea there's going to be a ceasefire and he's going to look like the guy that stopped the war. It's not going to happen. I mean, and as I illustrated in the last podcast we did on Ukraine, which obviously I did on my own, I made the point of all these proposals and why it was completely farcical, because in essence, they wanted to keep the option of NATO membership maybe in 10 years, 20 years. We want to keep militarizing Ukraine and put security guarantees in place, which is tantamount to being in NATO. It's not exactly Article 5, but it's kind of a watered down version of that. And there's no way that Russia will agree to that. So, I mean, I understand why Macron did what he did. I mean, and he's probably flown Zelensky in saying, let's hope you get a meeting with him. But Trump I can imagine, would have just basically told him the reality of the situation. You're not fighting this war anymore. The war's over. You need to start accepting that. Okay, Trump might feel he thinks he can have some leverage over the Russians. Well, he's not going to, but if he wants to believe that, he's entitled, obviously, to do so on that basis. So I think that's an important point to make. I mean, clearly, by all accounts, he didn't want to meet Zelensky. And I think he basically feels that it's a waste of time. And at some point, Zelensky is just going to have to accept the reality that the war's over, that Ukraine's lost the war. Okay, you can spin it any which way, how. And Zelensky almost certainly will go into exile in some country or other, probably the United States. I mean, at the end of the war, it's best for him if he does. And then the country has to move on in the future in whatever way unfolds as a result of the consequences of the catastrophic effect it's had on the country. Never mind the devastation of the war itself, but what's happened economically, financially, and societally. So I think they're important points to make.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's kind of funny because, when you see these bombastic speculations in the tweet that Donald Trump put out there, most people got to realize that politicians do not outwardly say in public what they believe, what they're going to do. They say things that either people want to hear or they say things that they want to impress that they're stronger than they are when they're actually weak. The art of the deal is in many ways very similar to the art of war. When you're weak, show that, project you're strong, and vice versa. And, he knows, I'm sure Trump knows, he's not totally stupid, that this is Putin's backyard and this is Putin's game. And all Putin has to say the next time that they get together and talk is, you made an agreement. Your country broke it, the Minsk agreement. So you're untrustworthy and have no integrity. And we're going to do what we have to do. End of story. You've got no background, leg to stand on. And that's the way it's going to be. The question then afterwards is, okay, how are we going to move forward as two superpowers? Are we going to be as equals or are we going to be as adversaries? And hopefully, judging by how Trump is treating China, it's going to be not as equals, but as adversaries. And so really there's very little foundation for the two countries to get together and work together in regards to West Asia, Eurasia, or any other places around the world until you actually come up with something that's going to be beneficial to both and, more importantly, beneficial to the world around us.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. Another problem is conscription in Ukraine. I mean, they're talking about mobilizing 18-year-olds. The Americans had the audacity to tell them to do it. Well, the Biden administration, that is, and even the Ukrainians admitting they're just literally getting to the point every man in the whole country, without exception, will be mobilized. They don't want to be. They feel, because they know what the life expectancy is on the front line. I mean, there's employees of recruitment centers are being reassigned to army positions. if they underperform in terms of recruiting people, this is how bad it is. And if you generally look, because they're trying to recruit everyone, nearly 50% of those they're trying to recruit are unfit for office for a whole bunch of reasons: age, health, etc., etc. But because Ukraine's lost so many men in the conflict, then back in May, it's worth noting, we've said this before, they imposed these stricter mobilization rules. I mean, and because there were so many people trying to leave the country with forged documents, leave illegally, particularly through Moldova, obviously paying thousands of dollars in to get out of the country. And this just is indicative of the fact that Ukraine has lost enormous amounts of military personnel, and they continue to do so. There's still claims about 2,000 Ukrainians are dying every day, and it's entirely feasible that that figure's correct. That's, including, of course, what's going on in Kursk region, which still persists. But if you look at it, Russia continues to destroy as well huge amounts of infrastructure, ammunition depots all over Ukraine. And they're hitting targets now in over 130 areas of the country. So not just obviously Donetsk and parts of Sumy, Kharkov, etc. And there are claims, and they have to be substantiated, that thus far in the war, Russia's destroyed around about 650 or more warplanes, nearly 300 helicopters, maybe 38,000 unmanned aerial vehicles, hundreds of surface-to-air missiles, maybe 20,000 tanks, and the list goes on and on and on. Thousands of multiple rocket launchers, and the West has got to the point where how much more can it give the Ukrainians? I mean, apparently the Danes have promised F-16s to the Ukrainians. Well, what happened to the F-16 they were already promised? None of them have even got off the ground. They're not flying them. I mean, Russia controls airspace in totality. So this is another indication of the severity of the problem. And, the people in Ukraine have had enough. And if you start trying to recruit 18-year-olds, people say, well, in World War II, 18-year-olds were recruited, but this isn't World War II. Times have changed. People are not so keen to see an 18-year-old go and fight a war, particularly not in Ukraine when they know the life expectancy is worse than it was in World War One. These are huge problems. And and there's no end to this. There's no way the Ukrainians can dig their way out of this mess. And this is why there's the question is, at some point, I think the US will put huge pressure on Zelensky and go, you will have to capitulate. The war will have to end. Okay, they might think it's going to end in ways that they'd like to believe was true, but the US and its allies are still in the denial phase of the war. And they have to go through all the stages to ultimately acceptance of what's going on. But denial is a powerful sort of drug, as it were, in inverted commas, and they're still largely stuck in that, and they don't want to accept the reality that Ukraine's lost the war already.
One thing for the long term, and this has been to me the problem of the West, and why those in China, Russia, and that have been much more successful, because they see things in the grander picture. Things aren't just simply reactionary from day to day, or the current greed of get this, and the hell with what the future brings. In 2022, the fertility rate in Ukraine was just 1.26. Now, for those who don't know, you need 2.01 just to have net zero population increase. 1.26 means, like Japan, within 2 generations, you could be completely gone. You've just eliminated, you want to bring the 18-year-olds in, you've just eliminated nearly all of the potential fertile men in Ukraine to birth the next generation. So whatever happens at the end of this, there's not going to be really any future for Ukraine to begin with. And interestingly enough, I visited Odessa in 2002 and 2004. And that was what, a decade after the fall of the Soviet Union. And at that time in Odessa, which is mostly Russian ethnic versus Kiev, which is more Cossack Ukrainian, the they told me that the ratio of women to men was 9-1 because after the fall of the Soviet Union, there was so much despondency that the men just, either committed suicide or they drank themselves into oblivion. And the same thing is happening now in Kiev. There's just, who's going to birth the next generation of Ukraine? It's going to be consumed by Poland, Romania, or Hungary, whoever. So Ukraine pretty much is doing what Lindsey Graham wants, sacrificing the country to the last man because potentially there's not going to be a Ukraine within a generation or so.
Well, not in terms of population, unless there's some big fundamental changes. But yeah, it's an extremely valid point. And I think just a final point, Ken, with regards to this kind of delusional ideas the West has about wanting to have a ceasefire and freeze the conflict. There are reports basically coming out the West that they want to send 100,000 troops to the country, meaning they're going to be NATO forces, not to, and I have to stress this, not to fight a war because the war's over at that point. But what they want to do is occupy Ukraine and freeze the conflict by deploying all these peacekeepers in the country. And this, and you could quite believe this to be the case. But from their perspective, of course, it's never going to happen because, in essence, where are these so-called peacekeepers going to come from? NATO countries. Then so effectively they would be dividing the country, almost like what happened to Germany at the end of World War II, except this could be, like Romania, Poland, whoever else involved. So the West then wants to occupy Ukraine by claiming it's for peacekeeping purposes. Well, this ends up exactly the kind of some nonsense that happened in North and South Korea. And look what happened there. Ukraine is not Korea. It's not going to end up that way in any way, shape, or form. As far as the Russians are concerned, if you want to have some sort of analogy of what happens in the future, Ukraine would have to become like Vietnam was at the end of the Vietnam War. Okay, less whatever Russia ends up having as then, as far as from a legitimate standpoint, regions that are part of the Russian Federation. But yeah, they want Romania to take part of it. No doubt Poland to take Western regions and whoever else. But this is not a reality. And to the idea that they think somehow there's going to be this frozen conflict, which will be along the lines of in parts of territory that Russia regards as the Russian Federation, is simply an absolute non-starter. And really, it's just creating a North Korea, South Korea, West Ukraine, East Ukraine. It's like West Germany and East Germany. It's a total disaster, and it's not going to happen. But they think that's going to be the result of this because they can't accept reality. They still want to live in denial. I mean, and they're not listening to a word the Russians are saying. And the risk is that the war will just carry on in perpetuity if on that basis. And we could be sat here literally in a year or 2 or 3's time with Russia taking most of the country. I'm not saying it will last that long. I'm trying to illustrate a broader point that it could just drag on forever until Russia controls most of the country. And even then, the West will still be in denial. And Ukraine, who knows, is going to be left to fight the war. What munitions are they going to even have at that point in time? But there just has to be a recognition and an understanding in the West the war's over. You need to cut the losses because they're just going to get infinitely worse. Accept the reality, take your dose of medicine and do what's best for what's left of Ukraine instead of using it as literally this battering ram or this awfully named but sadly true meat grinder, and just say, and this cannot continue. And the problem is, at this point in time, there is no evidence of that. They have evidence that the war is going to end, but they think it should end on their terms. Well, sad to say, but the wars end on the terms of those who win the war. And there is no way that Ukraine can win this war. It's absolutely an impossibility now.
Absolutely. Anyway, Paul, I think that's a good place to stop. Obviously, over the next 6 weeks, there's going to be a number of different things that we'll be able to talk about in regard to Ukraine. So everybody look forward to that. Paul, as always, thank you for your insight and for being a part of this discussion.
Yes, and likewise.
And to everybody here at the Sirius Report community, thank you as always for your support. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, comment, send this out to anybody you think would be important. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.